Okay, so 7:30, bang on the dot, pretty much. And welcome to the third episode in the Rucksack Club lockdown slideshows. Been pretty staggered by how well this has worked so far. So thanks all for turning out, brilliant. And even more amazed, actually, I don't know if you've noticed, but those who didn't make it, you can actually see the last two episodes on catch up, just like the BBC. We've had more than 300 downloads of the two videos we've had to date. So somewhere we've got a following, which is marvelous. Anyway, I'm sure this next episode will be even more exciting and fun-packed than the last two. And we've got Will somewhere, unless he's run away.
Yeah.
You can unmute yourself, Will. Brilliant, thanks. Will's going to talk us through some of the joys and excitement of expedition climbing, and particularly picking up on an amazing trip he had on the Infinite Spur in the Denali Range on Mount
Foraker. Mount
Foraker. There we go. So I think without further ado, Will, over to you.
Lovely, thanks. Right, folks, I'm just going to share screen with you. So if we wait for a moment. And any moment we will be greeted with photos. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you this evening about a trip that we did to Alaska 4 years ago. Before that, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the climbing that led up to going on this trip, and introduce you to my partners, and then talk a little bit about what I've been doing since then. So, like pretty much everybody in my generation, I started off climbing on an indoor climbing wall. I think sometimes people can be pretty doom and gloom, and particularly when the whole sort of BMC controversy a couple of years was rolling on. People seem to think that climbers who started off in climbing walls didn't go out into the real mountains, as it were. But I think my progress is pretty much like the progress of all of my friends, where I started out climbing indoors, then spent my university years bouldering around the Peak District, sport climbing, and making occasional trips to the Alps. From there, sort of moved on to the bigger, more adventurous climbs that you find in the British Isles. So I'm sure plenty of you are familiar with Gogarth Maincliff and its pinchy joys. From there, the natural continuation is to move on to ice climbing here in Konya, and onto the fantastic mixed climbing that we've got a wealth of in the UK. So this here is taken on Clogwyndy up above the Idwal slabs. Doesn't come into competition very often, but when it does, it gives, I think, some of the best mixed climbing in the world. Fantastic, steep, positive climbing, good hooks, good gear. And then obviously further north, we've got the same sort of joys up in Scotland. This photo is taken looking down Unicorn and Stob Conan Lochen, which is another brilliant sort of classic rock route. In summer, it goes at about E1. And then in winter, you've got really good hooks in the corners, lots of gear, and sort of fantastic physical climbing. Like lots of people, you sort of do those bits of climbing in the UK and realise that you can do the technical thing, but moving on to the bigger challenges further afield becomes quite enticing. And the next thing to do for us was to head out to the Alps and try and get stuck into the classic North Faces. So things like the routes on the Grand Duras, on the Drew, on the big walls in the Argentière Basin. And this photo is taken on a winter ascent of a route on the Chamonix side of the Vert. Now, when you go out climbing in the Alps in the summer, sometimes it can feel like it's pretty busy. You know, there's lots of people around, you've got to race to get to routes early and all that sort of stuff. But actually, if you go and you're happy to climb in winter, well, the days were a little bit short, it's a little bit colder. Quite often you can have the mountains entirely to yourselves. So when we did this route, which was early in December, we didn't see anybody from when we started walking up from the valley until when we got back down to the valley, which is pretty amazing on a popular mountain like the Vert. With the days being shorter, it does mean that you're going to start in the dark and probably do all of your descent in the dark as well. I think on this route, we started at about 2 o'clock in the morning and didn't get to the next hut until 2 o'clock the next morning, which is a pretty full day out. Another sort of favourite thing about climbing in the winter for me in the Alps is that you can get to all of these routes on the east face of Mont Blanc de Tacle and up in the Argentière Basin from the first cable car. So first bin goes up at 8 o'clock in the morning. From there, it's a 15-minute ski downhill to get to the base of your route. And then you can be on these fantastic steep ice and mixed routes, climb as many pitches as you want, and then abseil back to your skis and be back in town by 8 p.m. for beers and burgers, which is fantastic. After a little while, we started feeling like the Alps were all well and good, but we'd like a little bit more adventure from our trips. So me and a friend went on our first sort of greater ranges trip, if you like, out to the Alaskan Range, where we had a crack at this mountain in the background. This is the north buttress of Mount Hunter. So in the Denali Range, when you come into land at base camp, you've got 3 mountains dotted around you. You've got Mount Hunter, which is the shortest of the sort of big 3. Then Mount Foraker over to your left, and in the background's Denali. So on the first trip we came here, the route that we went up was on the buttress here. Can you all see my mouse? Yeah, yeah. And we tried a route that, well, did a route that heads up the buttress, up this mixed ground, up the ramps, and then up the further mixed ground above. It's a route called Deprivation, which was first climbed by the sort of influential alpinist Mark Twight back in the early 90s. And he wrote in the book Kiss and Kill, and then in his sort of seminal textbook, Extreme Alpinism. And he named it Deprivation after their sort of 40-hour push that they did to get up over the top of the mountain and back down in the face of a storm. We were pretty sort of influenced by the things that he'd written and thought we'd try a very similar approach. So we didn't get to the top of the mountain. We got to the top of the climbing that we can see in that photo in a 48-hour push, during which we had 2 hours of sleep. Now, I'm sure some of you do lots and lots of long distance running will know that your brain starts to get pretty mushy when you've been up and going for that long. And I think what that taught me is, well, you can move for a really long way for a long time. If you're going to be doing really technical climbing, where you're going to do a lot of abseiling and having to make tricky decisions about anchor selection and all that sort of stuff, it actually makes sense to, I think, stop and get some sleep before you make any life-confirming decisions. After that, sort of went on trips down to Patagonia, having a crack at climbing some of the towers there. Out to Nepal to have a go at climbing some of these mountains out here as well. And then in the summer of 2015, and I was climbing quite a bit with my friend Pete Graham, and he sort of tentatively asked if I'd be interested in coming back out to Alaska again in 2016 with him and Ben. Now, I'll introduce you to a little bit to them. I think that the most important thing about going on these trips is that you're with people that you really trust to make sound decisions in the mountains, and have got a similar sort of level of motivation and a similar risk tolerance to you. But I think it's also really important that you're with people that you're going to get on with.
We were warned about the possible not awesome internet from Chamonix, so hopefully we'll be back shortly to join us. Talk amongst yourselves in the meantime.
Hello. So he's in Chamonix, is he, at the moment?
He is indeed. That's where he lives. Yes,
okay,
absolutely.
Right. Okay. Very nice.
But unfortunately, I say the internet looks to be fairly cruddy.
Yeah.
Maybe the French authorities have sort of installed some kind of virtual lockdown and keeping Brits from.
He's done his hour. That's what it is. He's done his hour of exercise, and it's been cut off. We hear earlier, Martin, when Will was saying that they can go within a kilometre of home, but also only 300 metres vertical either way.
30 metres. Oh my goodness. Does the clock start when do you include sort of coming down from your upstairs? And I mean,
maybe you could just get the extra kind of 10, couldn't you, by being quite selective about where you started? That's a good idea, yes.
Dear, oh dear. Goodness.
Phil threatening to tell a story about Pete. Go ahead.
Yeah, so if you remember that picture of Will climbing an ice chute, that was called Lao Beige Direct, and basically I think it was the winter before this. So I'd been out in Chamonix. I went on my own, was doing a bit of skiing, and hooked up with Will, and we said, right, we'll go climbing. And Pete said, yeah, great, that'll be fantastic. We'll go to Konya for the day. And of course, me being a complete punter, I get dragged behind these. But then when we get out the car, Will says, "Oh, bit of a problem.
I know what's coming next."
He's here. Yeah. Do you want me to carry on, Will? Or...
Yeah. You carry on.
So basically, I forgot my ice axes, which is a bit of a problem when you're going to do a sort of 2-pitch route that's, for me, was absolutely desperate. So anyway, we got to it's all right. We'll sort it out. So we ended up doing this climb, and then each of the belays involved swinging the ice axes on a rope from above to the hapless second or third who had given the axes up. Now this is normally fantastic, it worked fine. But if the people who've done Lao Beige, the cockpit overhangs by about, 10 metres or something like that from the bottom. Maybe not as much as that. But so we ended up, after the second pitch, we ended up with Pete led it, and it was absolutely desperate, this thing. And he got to the top, and luckily for Will, one of his mates from Chamonix was at the belay and abseiling down. So we ended up with this comedy situation. I think there's a video of it somewhere. I've not got it. With a guy abseiling down on this like free hanging abseil with 2 ice axes attached to like a lasso with him, and then this comedy situation of swinging the ice axes round and round like in the sort of cowboy films and trying to chuck them to us at the belay. And I think it took about 4 goes to get it right, but I was just thinking to myself, how are we doing this route with 3 of us and only 2 pairs of ice axes? But it all worked out in the end, but it was quite a comedy situation to see these axes flying through the air and thinking, what happens if we don't actually get these? So that was my first experience of climbing with Pete and Will together, but obviously a sort of laissez-faire attitude toward the usual characteristics of climbing, I'd say.
Excellent. Thank you for ad-libbing there, Phil. Much appreciated. Will, are you back with us? Can we share your screen again?
I am back with you. I'll see if I can share the screen, but I'm logged in as Amy, so let's see what happens.
Oh, I'll make you. Sorry, I just need to make you a magic person. Don't worry. Okay. Yeah, you should be able to do that now. You could do if you hadn't frozen. Anyone else got some good stories about Will whilst he isn't here to defend himself?
Well, a good story, but hopefully the British Mountain Guides don't know about these kind of antics.
You'll know better, mate, Martin.
They wouldn't be none to use.
There we go. So sorry about that, folks.
What have I done?
Yeah. Whilst we are super lucky to be able to do this all the way from Chamonix, the internet does seem to be a little bit patchy here right now. I'll share screen and then carry on from where we started before. Brilliant. So can you all hear me?
Yep, you're good to go now.
Brilliant. So this next photo is from the Walker Spur in winter, where Pete snuggled in on the third day of an ascent of that route. Lots of hard mixed climbing. The thing that always sort of amazed me about Pete, or the thing that I find really inspiring, as well as being probably the most hardcore alpinist I know, is also a type 1 diabetic and deals with it amazingly. So even through sort of like big multi-day freezing cold climbs in the Alps and further afield, he just keeps a bag of insulin tucked into his shirt jacket and carries on. Sort of really keeps it going, which is, I find, super inspiring. The next guy that we went out with was Ben Sylvester. So this is Ben climbing a grade 9 on Ben Van called the God Delusion. He's a pretty handy summer climber as well, quite often doing routes like Conan like the Librarian down at Gogarth and lots of other E6s and E7s. So quite happy that whatever we found on the route, we'd be able to point one of those two at it and they'd sort out the difficulties for us, which was great. Now, Pete and Ben had climbed together quite a lot in the Alps and further afield before, and they got the names the Bivvy brothers for sucking up some pretty horrendous nights out. The next photo is Ben spending a night on Fitzroy in Patagonia in what I'd say I'm pretty envious of that particular night. So they'd been abseiling down through the dark, storm coming in, and realised that they were off the main abseil line and were now going to have to navigate their own way down some pretty complex alpine terrain. So doing the only thing that seemed sensible was lay down on this granite ledge on their ropes and waited for morning. I was pretty optimistic that we wouldn't have to do any of that when we got to Alaska, but as luck would have it, we always managed to get some pretty good bivvies, as you'll see later on. Now, we headed out to begin with, try and do a new route on the spire behind here called Thunder Mountain. The only route that had been climbed on there before was the sort of the ice streak that you can see to the left of the peak. And we were hoping we'd be able to do something more directly at the middle of the buttress. So we got dropped off by the plane and then went and had a look to see what we could get done. Unfortunately, what we found, instead of the bomber neve that we'd been dreaming of, was really deep, unstable snow plastered onto even really steep bits of rock, which is good for skiing, but absolutely terrible for climbing. And to sort of make matters worse, we found that there was these big snow mushrooms that were hanging over the edge of some of the blocks, but also tucked up underneath overhangs and threatening to fall down on us. So after about 18 hours of trying to battle our way up and realizing this wasn't going to happen, we retreated back down and phoned, using our sat phone, for the plane to come and pick us up to bump us around to Denali base camp. When we got around there, we decided that what we'd do is try and refocus on climbing the Infinite Spur, which is something that had been on our radar. But to do that, we needed to acclimatise to about 5,500 metres before we set off up the more difficult climbing. To do that, we went along the West Buttress in Denali, which I don't know, probably a few people in the club that have been on before. It's a fantastic scenic route involving a long winter camping trip up through a number of other places where you'll meet other climbers. So we loaded everything that we need for about 3 weeks onto our sledges and then set off, much to the amusement of the American climbers who couldn't believe just how incapable we were on skis with sleds. So this is us 3 days later, having got up to, first of all, to 7,000 camp, then up to 11,000 foot camp, and then doing a carry up to 14,000 foot camp. And in the background, you can see Mount Foraker, which was the peak that we really had our eyes set on. If you sort of look at the spur that comes down from the top of the mountain over Mont Crozon and then back down left towards base camp, that's the route that we descended after climbing the Infinite Spur. And that itself is a classic of the Alpine of the Alaska Range called the Sultana Ridge, which has got 3,200 meters of ascent from the Bergschrund up to the summit. So we sort of spent about a week up there on Denali with some mixed weather and some nice days, during which time we climbed higher and higher up the mountains trying to acclimatise. unfortunately, we didn't get good enough weather while we were acclimatized to make a dash to the summit, because as soon as we saw that there was a good window coming, we headed back down to base camp from where we could sort of stuff to head on around to the Infinite Spur. So a little bit of history about the route. The Infinite Spur was first climbed in 1977 by George Lowe and Michael Kennedy. It's 2,700 meters high from the Bergschrund up to the south summit, and then another 100 meters of height gain to get up to the north summit. When they climbed it back in the late 70s, they took 12 days to climb the route, carrying pretty heavy rucksacks. It then had a couple of ascents over the next sort of 20 years, and at the start of the 2000s, in 2001, it sort of came very briefly back into vogue when it had two ascents. One from Joe Poirier and Mark Westman, who are sort of real active Alaskan climbers. Joe went on to write the guidebook for the range, and Mark Westman is a climbing ranger there. So if you go for your briefing before going to fly into the Alaska range, you'll meet him there. I think they thought it had become the new classic of the range. It did get another ascent that year from Steve House, who many of you will know is sort of one of the most talented alpinists of that region, when they pushed it out and managed to climb the route in a 3-day round trip from base camp, which was pretty impressive, to say the least. They actually, when they wrote the guidebook, put this route in it thinking that it would get a lot more traffic. As it happened, it only had one more attempted ascent in the next 15 years, and that was an unfortunate attempt from Karen McNeil and Sue Knott, who were sort of two of the leading American alpinists of the time, who sadly went missing somewhere on the top of the mountain. So we set off to head on round to try it. We took enough food for 6 days, hoping that we'd be able to do it a little bit quicker than perhaps some of the parties before us, other than the sort of heroes, but not in the full sort of smash and grab style, more of a traditional camping alpine style. To keep our bags nice and light, we had a 30-litre rucksack for the leader, which we put the sleeping bags and down jackets in, and then two 40-litre rucksacks for the seconds. So if you imagine, that's probably the similar sort of size bag that you'd take for a Scottish winter climbing outing. Part of the way that we did that was to take a 1.5-man tent and 2 sleeping bags between the 3 of us, so we could zip them into a blanket, put all of our clothes on, and get in and sort of huddle into the night. And that's what we did. On the first day, we climbed over these couple of cols. Maybe took us 12 or 14 hours to get around to underneath the route where we spent the night. The next day, we knew we had the technical crux of the climbing, which was not super difficult by modern standards, maybe about Scottish grade 6, climbing up a mixed buttress. Here you can sort of see we'd climbed some of the steeper grounds and then came across to get to our first bivvy. And luckily we had a topo, so we got ideas about places where we might have been able to dig in to get a bit of a ledge. In fact, we've talked to Mark Westman, who'd made the last previous ascent back in 2001 when we'd gone for our ranger briefing. And he'd given us some pretty good advice about places we might be able to sleep. So we got up to this snow slope, dug in, threaded the rope into the back of the tent, knowing that we'd need to stay tied in for the night, and then climbed in. Now, unfortunately for Pete, who was on the outside, the snow ledge collapsed over the first few hours that we were in there. So while I on the inside was very comfortable, Pete was effectively a human porter ledge for the rest of us. So while I was happily snoring, we woke up at about midnight to find that the chances of us all getting any more sleep had long passed. So we were up after maybe 3 or 4 hours in sleep and into what turned into another 24 hours of climbing. So we started heading up some mixed grounds and then up these steep neve slopes where we could dig in and get some ice screws as we were moving together. And then up into what was perhaps the part of the route that we were most worried about, the Black Band. That's by the sort of the easiest way to get through it. It's only 2 pitches. The first pitch is, I can only describe as pretty like climbing on left-hand red wall at South Stack, so quite steep and on pretty chossy rock. And the top pitch was this sort of very brittle ice that was luckily gluing the loose stuff together. Luckily, that was Pete's block. Above that, we sort of climbed up more steep snow slopes when these guys came past us. So the guy on the right is Colin Haley, who some of you will know from his antics down in Patagonia. He's probably the best alpinist of our generation. And we'd sort of struck a deal with him that because we knew that he wanted to try and make a speed ascent, to try and break the record for how long somebody had climbed it in, we'd break the trail up all the lower technical part of the route, and then he'd put the trail in on the top part of the route after he'd started after us and came past us. As luck would have it, there was lots of soft snow lower down, but lots of neve at the top. So I feel like we got the short end of the bargain on that one, but he came blasting past us. We carried on climbing into the dusk. This is probably after about 20 hours of climbing on that day, when we were pretty keen to try and get somewhere that we could bivvy. And we knew what we were aiming for was a luxurious bivvy higher up on the route. However, when we got there, we just found a snow crest. Not exactly what we're looking for, but we managed after a couple of hours of effort to get down to something that we could pitch our 1.5 person tent on. It was a pretty airy spot for the night, so that was our second in a row where we'd been tied into our harnesses for the whole night. When we're on these big routes, instead of swinging leads pitch by pitch like you do when you climb in at Gogarth or on some of the Scottish winter routes, we do what we call big blocks. So for maybe 10 pitches or half the day, you get to be out in front with the light bag, but it's your job to sort of maintain momentum and keep the team moving. I'd climbed a big block at the start of the second day, but hadn't climbed anything on the first day. So on the third day, when it came to the top 1,000 meters of steep mountaineering, it was my turn to get the rope on and keep going. As we were getting up there, the views were really spectacular. I must admit, when we got up to the summit, having been on the go for another 12 hours, so probably meaning we'd been moving for about 40 of the last 50 hours, we were all pretty emotional. And the next video, which will hopefully play, will show you the views that we were met with. It's really an incredible place to be. We couldn't see any sign of human habitation or anything. There's no roads. There's nothing that you can see for, well, for thousands, certainly hundreds of kilometers. And other than seeing Colin and Rob come past, we hadn't seen anybody else for the last 5 days. So it really was a pretty magical experience to be up there. You can hear it's quite windy. Earlier on in the day, it had been really, really windy, and we were actually pretty worried. We'd tried to huddle into a crevasse to melt some snow, but hadn't been able to find anywhere that we could actually stop without getting really, really cold. So when we finally started our descent about 1,000 meters and managed to find a crevasse that we could climb inside, having very carefully probed the snow bridge to see if it would hold us, get out of the wind and melt some water, we were pretty happy. So hopefully you'll be able to hear this video, a little bit of audio from Pete. That gives you an idea that we were feeling pretty wrecked by that point. but we'd still got to descend the Sultana Ridge, which, as I was saying earlier, is about 3,200 meters high and involves another 800 meters of ascent on your way down to get over Mont Crozon and all the other sort of little bumps on the way along. We were pretty happy. The wind had dropped again and it looked like the weather window was holding, and it did as we continued and got most of the way along to Mont Crozon, where we could turn right and then descend the last sort of 1,500 meters down to base camp. Then the weather came in, got pretty Scottish. At this point, we were sort of quite happy to be heading back towards our tents and back to some more food. And as tends to happen, it was this point that Pete fell into a crevasse. As luck would have it, we got the rope a little bit tighter than in this photo. So he was able to get his ice axes off his bag and climb back out whilst we were pulling up on the baby bouncer. Sort of through that evening, we got lower and lower, hoping that we'd be back for that night. But as we got lower down, we were sinking up to our waists in uncontrolated snow. So had a final sort of 2 hour stop and brew up in the tent before that we could start at dawn, when the snow had started to crisp up a little bit more. And the sort of final, I don't know, 5 or 6 hour walk in the morning to get back to the tent, we really were sort of over it. And at that point, I think part of the sort of the joy of the teamwork really came together, that we were down to our last.
Okay, so answer on a postcard. Last what? ... Fill in the gap. Roll of toilet roll?
Have you seen the size of that pot they've got there, Dom?
I know, it's
It looks
impressive,
like
isn't
20
it?
litres. I'm just amazed to carry that with them.
Was it a last beer?
Oh,
Yeah,
no one told me it was that serious.
I'm generally quite surprised. I can't believe they've carried that. That's awesome.
I don't know if anyone
Well, if it
saw
was me, Dominic, it would be tea bags.
you're right. Yeah, yep.
I could have a bath in that.
God, yeah, you could, couldn't you?
Yeah.
They must have found that. I can't believe they took that route with them.
Yeah, I'm
You never
pretty
know.
sure this photo's from back when they were in base camp.
Yes. Sounds more like
See the size of a person, or am I getting something wrong here?
No.
He hadn't had very much to eat.
yeah. It's quite slim.
If anyone remembers the was it Bill Birch, Eddie Birch? I can't remember Bill. Doing the north face of
The Matterhorn.
the Matterhorn.
Eddie.
And it was a sack of potatoes they carried up because he'd been told that potatoes are good hill food, and a saucepan twice that big to boil in, apparently. Bad advice and things you shouldn't follow. And no doubt, oh, Will's coming back.
We're trying.
We're just telling more stories about you, Will. You shouldn't leave the room if I were you. But you left us on a bit of a cliffhanger there. We got to you were down to the last ... and we weren't sure what. So we weren't sure if it was a beer or toilet roll.
Unfortunately, it wasn't down to the last beer. It was the last energy gel, which is a much sadder thing to be down to. I'll see if I can screen share. Could you give me screen sharing rights again, please, Dom?
Sorry. Yeah, it should be sorted out now.
Brilliant, thanks. Sorry. So, as I was saying, Pete very gracefully gave me his last energy gel to get me back across the glacier to base camp, where we were pretty happy to be back, where we could eat everything that we wanted to eat, melt loads of water and relax. When we were back, we caught up with Colin, who at this point, we sort of knew that he probably wasn't done for the season, being a sort of full-time alpinist with a pretty ambitious schedule. And he'd already set a record by solo in a big route on the south face of Denali and making the first solo ascent of a route on the north buttress of Mount Hunter. So, when he sort of told us that he might be going off for a little bit more climbing, we suspected that he was off to make a victory lap on the Infinite Spur. And in fact, that's what he did. He went off planning to do it in 2 days and got caught in a storm, which meant he was out for 5. So when he finally staggered back into base camp, he was looking pretty shaken by the whole experience. But it really sort of highlighted to me that these world-class athletes who climb full-time can do amazing things, especially when their risk tolerance is sizable. So I thought, I wrote articles for the Rucksack Club Journal for probably 5 years in a row about these sorts of trips that I was going on. And then for the last 3 years, there hasn't been anything quite that exciting going on. What I've been doing instead is trying to finally find a way to sustain myself. And I've been training to be an international mountain guide. And these photos are from last summer, where I was working, taking people out on the mountains around home here in Chamonix, here on the Moine, here up on the traverse of the Eiger on the Mittelegi Ridge. And alongside that, been doing quite a bit of sport climbing, personal climbing in the mountains, getting on the big routes, things like the Drew, where you can go and have an adventure closer to home, and also doing a little bit of steep skiing. So things like this, the northeast couloir of the Baloiseau, where you're sort of maybe skiing like Scottish Grade 1 gullies, but have a proper mountaineering day out to get up into them and then ski on back down. I would have sat my final ski exam to be well on my way to being able to work with my own clients for myself last week, but sadly that's going to have to wait for another wee while until after all the coronavirus stuff is over. The last thing that I was going to quickly talk about was the Rucksack Club Expedition Grant, which is something that Andy Tomlinson and Keith Trowell and myself put together a couple of years ago. Now, all of the trips that I made in my 20s, from the photos that you've just seen, were possible because of grants that you got from people like the Mount Everest Foundation, which reinvests the interest on the money from the first Everest expedition into trips for young people, young climbers, to go off to interesting places. And we thought that it might be a nice idea for the Rucksack Club to do something similar, partly to let younger climbers and younger members who perhaps can't do these things off their own back to go and do them, but also as a way to try and get more young members interested in what the club's doing and showing them why, well, giving them a sort of an incentive to come and get on board. And the idea being that once they come and see what we're all about, come to meet, that they'll stay for life. And I think that is a work in progress, but something we're working on. So if anybody on the thing today meets that criteria and you've got a trip that you'd like to talk to us about, then get in touch. So that's the end of my slideshow. Are there any questions about any of that?
Can we have a, I'm going to unmute everyone and have a round of applause first, Will. That was awesome. If I can, well done.
Thank
Fantastic.
you. Yeah, you will.
Thank you.
Yeah, questions for Will.
Yeah, that was really good. Really enjoyed that. How did you find getting down to El Chalten in Patagonia? Was it difficult? Well,
Yeah.
He's got.
Oh, you've upset him. Yes.
Think how do you? Yeah.
Wrong question.
Yeah, wrong question. I've gone now.
Will is still muted. He needs to be unmuted.
We're having more technical issues here, I'm afraid. We actually didn't climb the El Chalten Massif. We were climbing further north around Lago Central.
Yeah. Because I was working in Chile
in an area called the Aviano Towers.
Right, it's a place I really want to go to, and I was so close, but I couldn't go there due to work reasons,
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing area, and the scale of the climbing is fantastic. The only thing that I'd caution against a trip there to climb is that the weather is pretty awful. So the chance of going down and spending a month and not doing very much climbing is quite high, as we found to our expense.
Some of the Chileans did suggest that there's some mountain ranges north of Santiago that nobody goes to, where the weather's better. I don't know much about them, but the locals did say that's a good place to go.
Nice.
6,000 metre peaks, that kind of thing.
Brilliant. I mean, there's a vast amount of unclimbed rock down there. For the sort of the big wall-minded people, there's some definite big walling adventures to be had as well. So I know I've tried to sell this to Bill and Don before, but I think they're unconvinced.
Not necessarily. We've got a new, whole new horizons to explore once this is all over. So who knows?
Hey, Will, thanks for that. In terms of your tactics for that route specifically and what you took and the sacrifices you made gear-wise, if you were doing it again, would you leave anything behind or take anything differently to what you did?
I think if I was going to go in that style, where we were going to be camping, we'd go probably with about as much as we did take. We felt that we'd pared down this rucksacks as light as we could get them to give us a sort of a margin of error, where if the weather forecast changed and we had to dig in for a longer period, we'd be able to survive. I think if we'd have had to spend many more days out, we'd have been very hungry, but we made sure that we took enough gas so that we'd be able to keep melting snow if we needed to, thinking that we'd be able to get down as long as we could drink, even if we were pretty hungry. But
how much gas did you take, Will?
So we took one petrol stove with a canister, like a full canister of that, and then took one of the normal size sort of screw-on gas bottles that we could use with our hanging jet boil for each day that we were out. And between 3 people, one of the normal size seems to work reasonably well if you're melting snow. Yeah, I mean, I think the other approach to take is the sort of super light and fast approach that Colin took and that Steve House and Rolo Garibaldi took on their ascent. But the margin of error there, if the weather changes, is pretty close to the bone. I think if I'm going to go on, well, I hope that I will go on other big trips, maybe to the south face of Denali, and there's various things in the Himalaya I'd like to go and try. I'd take the same approach of taking a tent and sleeping bags, but taking the super light modern equipment that means that you can still move quite fast.
Oh, I was gonna say well done for not dropping your rucksack on this one as well.
Everyone's getting them in.
You got there before me, Joe.
They are, of course, referring to an abortive attempt on a new route in Nepal that was waylaid after 1,000 metres or so of climbing by me dropping a rucksack in a rather precarious position.
I was working in the. I was working in the rescue post when Will appeared.
Any more questions for Will? I was going to ask one, Will. You say about your appetite for risk or acceptance of risk and how that's a factor in these things. Interested to contrast how risky you find guiding unknown clients in the Alps versus climbing Alaskan peaks with people you know and trust. I mean, what's the kind of the contrast there between those two experiences?
I think the key for me is that I really sort of dial back the difficulty and the sort of inherent danger in the activity. I mean, there's no getting around the fact that trying to climb these big routes in places like Alaska has a certain amount of risk involved. And we do things to try and mitigate that. Like climbing as a 3 is a very conscious decision, because the thought is that if something goes wrong, if there's only one of you and you've got to drag your broken mate, it's pretty hard work. But with 2 of you, you can maybe make something happen. in the Alps tend to not get onto big serious routes, or routes where if somebody trips, we're both going to die, unless I've been out with people for a day or two to make sure that they can do what they're telling me that they can do. So that's the sort of main way that you manage that risk, is to try and make sure that you only tie yourself to people in dangerous situations when you're pretty sure that they're not going to do anything too rash. And lots of practice of short roping and that sort of stuff. I think the other thing is that you can make choices in the Alps about the sorts of routes that you go into and what condition you're willing to go onto them. So only picking to go onto knife edge ridges when there's good snow underfoot instead of black ice, and not doing routes that have got lots of seracs or regular rockfall. But there is, I mean, sadly, guides die every year, and it'd be foolish to think that you're an expert so you can avoid that, because there is always that risk, but that you've just got to do what you can.
Well, can I ask, what was the aspect of the infinite Spur, and also what the weather forecast? Were you able to get good weather forecasts?
The aspect's southerly, so it's actually quite warm. Lower down, we were getting really quite hot during the day. For weather forecasts, the national park issues a forecast every day for the mountain, which is reasonably accurate. And we actually had a sat phone with us that we could get a text message once a day from a friend back home who was sort of keeping an eye on things to try and keep us informed about what was going to come our way. I think the question about aspect, because the route starts at just over 2,000 meters and finishes at just over 5,000 meters, the sort of heat of the day low down on the buttress, which was making the quite deep wet snow sort of melt quite fast, actually meant that when we were higher on the mountain and it was very cold with the winds, the sun had a bit of warmth to it, which was pretty nice. I think if we would have been on a north face at that altitude that time of year with the wind, it would have been pretty worrying for fingers and toes.
Any more questions for Will?
Yeah, just one more, Dominic. Will,
Yeah.
How much Imodium did you take on the trip?
I think when you're eating the sort of dehydrated meals that we were eating, none's necessary.
Well, no, I beg to differ.
No evening talk is complete without a poop question. I mean, it's just essential. Yeah, those of you doing future talks, just brush up on the poop story to go with it, because it's always going to come up. Fantastic. Well, so another virtual round of applause for Will. That's absolutely awesome. I'm completely
Thank you, Will.
terrified.
Thank you, Will. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay. Brilliant. So a couple more things then from me. One is just to run through. We're now taking bookings into July, would you believe, for this this event. So I'll just kind of run through forthcoming attractions, and then at the end of that, we're going to have an experiment, which is to because it's really nice to chat. It's very hard to chat in a sea of 100 faces. So by the magic of this Zoom thing, we're going to throw you all into random little huddles of half a dozen people to have a 10-minute chat. If you don't want to bother with that, then just log off and we'll see you next time. If you do, hang on. If it goes completely pear-shaped, then we'll just see how it works out. So just first up with the forthcoming attractions bit. There we go. Next week we've got a fantabulous mishmash of stuff. We've got a 3 faceted view of all aspects of stuff rucksacky. So Warb is going to talk us through a great adventure on Carmore Crag. Lisa and Harry are then going to talk about the Wainwright ticking they've been engaged in, with some fantastic shots of the lakes that we're all feeling a bit envious of just now because we can't get there. And Dave Palmer's going to pick up with some of his efforts in ticking a whole bunch of Alpine 4000s in the last couple of years. So that's next week. The week after, Phil, Mark and Rich are going to, this is Phil's very modest title, 3 once-a-year weekend warriors go to Chamonix. So it's brave tales of a friendo Spur ascent, which should be lots of fun and games. Then we're into second week of May. Andy and Debs are going to talk us through a trip around Ladakh on bikes and some of the experiences, cultural and otherwise, when they got there. Moving on from there, we've got our very own superstar photographer. John's going to share some of his picks. He's been a bit reticent of a title so far, but they are bound to be gobsmacking photographs. So looking forward to that, John. And then end of May, another 3-headed offering. David Nightingale is going to talk about some Himalayan trekking, and then Ray and Helen and Roz are both going to fill us in with some of their exploits and great picks. And then moving into June, we move to Norway, where Hamish is going to talk about I think he said 35 pitch Norwegian adventure on the north face of Stettin, which is
Technically, it's a 53 pitch. But...
I thought as much, yes, because you run a few together, didn't you? 53 is a monster, isn't it?
Yeah.
So looking forward to that, and looking to be some absolutely gobsmacking scenery along the way. Then we've got more Himalayan stuff, but with a different twist here. Paul and Rachel are going to fill us in on the adventure they had, which involved quite a lot of work with local community and really putting something back, as well as bagging Chile West along the way. So that should be a really interesting story. So tons to look forward to. So pay attention, watch your space, follow the website. And then in my attempt to do this breakout group thing, so this is a bit like one of those kind of sci-fi movies where you kind of dematerialize and you materialize somewhere else. So hold on to your seats, and I can't promise it's going to work. So if it doesn't work, see you next week. But let's have a go. Okay, you're just about to disappear into some rooms. Bye.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Cheers, Tom. Thank you.
Off you go.
Cheers. Cheers, Tom.
Okay.
Allez, bonne nuit.
So now you'll get a little sign that says join a breakout room, and you have to click the button that says, yeah, that's okay, off I go. Okay?
Time for some wine.
Yeah, that'll work as well. Cheers, Andy.